Okay, I'll try to keep to 10 minutes. It should be possible. So the first talk is going to focus on the current status and risks as assessed in this report. And the next talk will focus on response options. So this is a little bit negative, but you'll get more positive stuff in the next talk. So to start with, just an outline of the structure of the report. If you're not familiar with the report, there are 7 chapters, and 2 of which are dedicated to desertification and land degradation, and specifically their interactions with climate. So at the higher level, one of the findings from this report, land is a critical resource which we rely upon for food, water, health and our well-being, but it's under pressure from human land use, but also increasingly from climate change. So, starting with desertification and the assessment and looked at the current status. So the range and intensity of desertification has increased in dryland areas over the past decades. And I should say, in the context of this report, desertification refers to degradation that happens in dryland areas. So drylands cover around 46% of the global land area and are home to about 3 billion people, so a really large number of people living in these parts of the world. The major human drivers of desertification are expansion of croplands, unsustainable land management, and increased pressure from population and income growth. Importantly, the report found that climate change will exacerbate several desertification processes and increase the risks from this. Moving on then to land degradation, and again looking at the current status. So land degradation adversely affects livelihoods and occurs on over 1/4 of the Earth's land area, ice-free land area. So again, unsustainable land management is key here, and human actions are the direct driver of most of this. Indeed, agriculture is the dominant sector when it comes to land degradation. There are serious implications for natural resource-based livelihoods, and societal groups will be most affected by this degradation. And again, as with desertification, for land degradation, climate change will exacerbate the rate and magnitude of many of these processes. So here's one of the figures from the report, which is panel F from figure SPM1, and this shows some of the trends in terms of land degradation and desertification. So line 1 represents population in areas experiencing desertification since 1961. Line 2 shows dryland areas in drought annually. You can see that is a much more jumpy line, lots of intra-annual variation there, but there's generally an increasing trend. And the third line shows a decrease in the inland wetland extent. So in terms of desertification, since 1961, the area in drylands in drought has increased by more than 1% per year. So that's that wavy line, line number 2 on the figure. But I think a more stark finding was that 500 million people lived in areas which experienced desertification in 2015. So that really is a very large number of people. In terms of land degradation, soil erosion is often an indicator used to look at land degradation, and erosion from agricultural fields is around 10 to 20 times the rate at which soil itself is formed. And if you look at conventional tillage systems, it's more than 100 times the rate at which soil is formed. So it's really quite stark numbers there. Just a few notes on this figure actually. So the data shown in this figure are global, but there are obviously really important regional differences, and if you wanted to look at some of those regional differences, I'd suggest having a look in the chapters where there are case studies which show some of those in more detail. And also another point actually is that the author team really struggled in some ways to find reliable time series global data sets for things such as soil erosion. So there's a data gap here, and this was encountered particularly for land degradation, I would say. So there's more that could be done to improve that in the future. So overall, it's a challenging situation. Land use and land use intensification have changed dramatically in the past 50 years, and this has primarily been driven through changes in population and the demand for food, feed, fiber and energy. And this has placed increasing pressure on the land system. And along with climate change now, that's exacerbated. So desertification and land degradation affect crop productivity, but they also affect biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And there's consequences then for the carbon and water storage capacity of the land itself. So through land degradation and desertification, climate change will have a detrimental effect on livelihoods, habitats and infrastructure. So looking in a little bit more detail at how climate is adding further pressure to this situation. So for desertification, increased land surface air temperature and evapotranspiration, along with decreased precipitation in dryland areas, is contributing to desertification. In terms of degradation, just to name a few, rainfall intensity, flooding, drought frequency, sea level rise, all these things are exacerbating land degradation. Importantly, there are implications then for the land system capacity to act as a carbon sink, and I'll come back to this a little bit later as well, but there really are knock-on effects for the effectiveness of the land system to act as a carbon sink. So I wanted to show one of the other figures from the SPM. So this is figure SPM2, and this is an assessment of risk in the report, and risks related to human systems here from climate change, but not just in terms of increasing global mean surface temperature, which is shown in the top panel, but also in terms of socio-economic development. For the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to focus on panel A, which is risk as a function of increasing temperatures. So for those not familiar with these diagrams, white indicates undetectable risk, yellow moderate risk, red high, and purple very high risk. And I'm not going to discuss this in any detail really, but what the takeaway message is for these different processes. So we have things like dryland water scarcity, vegetation loss, permafrost degradation. The transitions are quite different if you look across the range of embers. So you can see that at 2 degrees warming, the risks are quite different between food supply instabilities, for example, which is at a very high level, compared to soil erosion, which is somewhat lower. So looking in a little bit more detail at 2 of these embers in particular, one for desertification, dryland water scarcity, and the other soil erosion, which represents land degradation here. And again, at current temperatures, which is represented by the grey bar, we can see that there's moderate levels of risk, I should say, associated for both of these. However, if we go to 2 degrees of warming, risks from dryland water scarcity have become high at that point. And then at around 3 degrees, risks from dryland water scarcity are very high, and risks for soil erosion are high. So you can see that limiting warming well below 2 degrees Celsius has important implications when it comes to land degradation and desertification in terms of risk. So coming towards the end of this talk, I want to focus a little bit more on emissions and degradation. So land degradation itself can be a driver of climate change, and this is because the degradation processes often result in a release of greenhouse gases and reduced carbon uptake. Now, in some cases, land degradation can be avoided, reduced, or reversed, and the same goes for desertification, which is important, and you'll hear more about that in the next talk. But I think it's important to point out that if there's a lack of action to address land degradation and desertification, it's really inconsistent with the emission reductions required to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Another point worth mentioning is that large-scale biomass production for bioenergy can potentially increase competition for land, and this could also have serious consequences for land degradation as well as food security. So a little bit more on limits to adaptation and the land-based carbon sinks. So in terms of the ability to prevent and reverse desertification and land degradation, there are limits to what we can actually do. So for desertification, where there's a complete loss of land productivity, for example, the options we have to address that are really limited. There's not a lot we can do. For land degradation, there are also limited options to address things such as coastal erosion, permafrost thaw, and extreme soil erosion. So for these sorts of things, really the main driver is the global mean surface temperature increase, as opposed to actions to stop these things happening. So that really is a strong signal that we need to do as much as we can to limit global warming. And then in terms of the capacity of the land system to act as a carbon sink, I think this is a really important finding from these chapters and indeed in the SPM, that in terms of the carbon stored in soils and biomass, there are limits. So mature vegetation and soil carbon reservoirs reach saturation points eventually. And indeed, the carbon stored in these systems is vulnerable to loss in the future. And so this is quite important as well. And this loss could be due to extreme climate events, for example, or indeed through human mismanagement of systems, such as deforestation. So with that, I'll finish up. And I just want to say that this, in terms of land degradation, ties in with the overall messages of the report, in that unless we tackle desertification and land degradation, we're really limited when it comes to land being part of the solution. And with that, I'll say thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So the next speaker is online, I hope. Minal, can you hear me? I hope I can hear you. So Minal Pathak is a senior scientist for the IPCC Working Group 3 Technical Support Unit. She's based at the Global Center for Environment and Energy at Ahmedabad University in India. And she's a specialist of mitigation. Minal will provide an overview of land degradation and desertification in the climate change and land reports, with a focus on solutions, response options, integrated within sustainable development. So I'm looking at the persons who help connect, and I hope it works. We are almost there. I think the slide is on. Oh, perfect. We can hear you. Hello, Minal.
Okay, great. I'm going to turn off my video. Hi, Valerie. Thank you so much, and thanks, Eamon. Apologies, everyone. I'm not able to be with you in person, but I'm still glad to have this opportunity. I'm not actually. I'm sitting comfortably at 30 degrees, so I hope you can hear me well. I'll be following up on Eamon's presentation, and I'm discussing the response options in the context of land degradation and desertification and climate change options.
Can you just wait? Minal, can you just wait?
Sorry?
Can you just wait for 1 second? We need to have your slides.
Can you hear me, Valerie?
Yes, but we are waiting for some adjustments so that we see your slides on the screen. Can you please wait for 1 minute? Thank you very much.
I will.
Okay. Okay. I'm also asking for the technical staff if you can slightly reduce the volume for the voice of Minal. It's a little loud in the room. We are almost there. You can see we're working hard to reduce travel emissions by facilitating remote participation to the side events. And it's working. So Minal, your slides are on the screen, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
That is great. Thank you, Valerie. Is this volume good enough, or is it too loud?
It's fine here, I think. We just can't see you, but we can hear you very well. We can hear you. The main challenge is that your slides do not move to the next ones. So the sound works really well, but we need your slides to move, and it's not the case on our screen here.
Minal, you are controlling the slides. So you have to click on your PowerPoint presentation and click next.
I am controlling the presentation and I am on the same slide.
It seems there's a jet lag for the slides here.
Sorry, we haven't really, yeah.
Minal, can you try to disconnect the desktop sharing and connect it again?
Okay. Are you able to see my screen now?
Yeah.
Are you able to see the second slide now?
Yes, it's perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Let's hope we don't have any more hiccups now. So what I was mentioning was that a lot of these options also contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals and other societal goals. I move to the next slide. This is one of the figures from the SPM, and you probably cannot read all of these, but basically what I'm trying to show is these 5 columns in which the list of options is assessed for their contribution to climate change mitigation, adaptation, land degradation, desertification, and food security. So these responses can be categorized by the type, whether they are land options, they address value change, or whether they address risk management. These can also be classified on the basis of the magnitude they have on mitigation, as in the responses which show a high level of mitigation potential, which is greater than 3 gigatons, and the responses which do not or introduce competition for land. I move to the next slide, and this is the criteria for classifying the magnitude of impact. So the blue indicates the positive impacts and the orange indicates the negative impacts. For the land options, the magnitude is defined in square kilometers of land, and in the case of adaptation and food security, these responses are assessed on the basis of the people they impact. So that is the million people impacted. So for example, an option which has a large mitigation potential would sequester about 3 gigatons CO2 equivalent per year. But in the case of adaptation, it would be positive for more than 25 million people. I move to the next slide. And this one shows the land management options which have a large mitigation potential. Options for agriculture, which include agroforestry, pasture management, and any option that introduces or improves soil moisture, reduces loss of soil carbon. They can address multiple challenges. So you can see agroforestry contributing to mitigation, adaptation, desertification, and land degradation. Similarly, in the case of fire management, it can address mitigation and both of the land challenges, land degradation and desertification. The high, medium, and low also confidence in the assessment by standard IPCC process. I move to the next slide, which is on reforestation and forest restoration. And there are 4 benefits to this restoration and
the drivers, and understanding response options would be suited in a particular context. And therefore, all these decisions need to involve local people that can help advance some of these synergies. And women are, of course, impacted by land degradation, also due to their reduced tenure and reduced ability to contribute to decision making. So empowering women can actually bring some of these synergies and co-benefits to household security, but also to sustainable land management. Hello? And some of the policies that address barriers to women's participation are direct finance transfers to women, anti-poverty programs, but also programs that enhance health and education and training of women. And some of these can be done through women's community organizations. So I will stop here, and I just hope you were able to hear me through the presentation.
Yes, the sound was perfect. Thank you very much. And please stay with us for the Q&A session after the next two presentations, Minal. So the next speaker...
It's always challenging to present remotely because you can't see the audience, so you don't know if, but I'm glad it worked. Yeah, I'll close my sound now.
You had the audience was really focused on listening to your words. You couldn't see it. So the next speaker is Balgis Osman El Hasha. Balgis is a lead author of the Climate Change and Land Special Report. And she's a climate change and green growth specialist and regional coordinator at the North Africa Development and Business Delivery Center of the African Development Bank. And so you'll talk about the land report in the African context. So we are waiting for the slides to show on the screen.
Yeah.
So just a few minutes.
Okay, waiting for the slides.
Yes. And you have a clicker, I think, here. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Is that your presentation?
No, I saw it.
It's not this one.
I gave it to you. Yeah?
Sorry. Okay.
From IPCC.
One more minute. Thank you for your patience.
So I'm going to speak about the land degradation and desertification in the context of Africa. And in the interest of time, I can start. So the relationship between land and climate is, yes? All these are in mine. It's called IPCC. No, none of this. Sorry.
Okay.
Let me see. Maybe I give you my laptop.
Is it on your laptop?
Yes.
It has to be on a
But
USB.
I sent you also. Maybe you use the version that I sent you yesterday.
I don't think you said.
I sent you. Yeah, I sent you last night.
Where's the presentation? It's not on the key?
He said in the, I don't know, they mix the keys or what. But I sent her yesterday. Maybe she can find in the email.
2 more minutes of patience. Sorry for that.
It was too big to send by email, so you didn't send it to me.
It didn't come through?
No, it was too big to send
I
to
see.
me, so you didn't send it.
Okay, okay.
So do you have it on a different
I have it.
Okay,
in
the
laptop.
presentation for Pirawan is ready, so we are going to switch. Pirawan, can you join me? Thank you very much. So Pirawan will provide a perspective on indigenous women and indigenous knowledge for sustainability in Nepal, the Philippines and Thailand. Pirawan belongs to the Karen indigenous group from Chiang Mai, Thailand. She's currently working with the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, which is a regional organization that works for promoting and protecting indigenous peoples' rights. thank you very much for joining us here and providing a complementary perspective to the IPCC report.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's really honored to be here. And I think I'm the only indigenous person here. Nila Rekawada Yamila Pokime, hello Kosote. My name is Pirawan, or my current name is Pokime, which is one of the flowers that grow in the rotational farming and is resilient to the drought. So this is the photo for the women who are in the rotational farming. That is about to harvesting time that we are taking this photo. Just give you the brief information about my organization where I represent. So we are the Indigenous People Movement Organization which is based in Chiang Mai, Thailand. But we have members in 48 organizations in 14 countries. So these are all the Indigenous People organizations. And we come together collectively to raise our voice and our issue. I just would like to share some of our knowledge regarding to the land, how Indigenous people still having the green forest and clean water until now in our ancestral land. So this is one of the agriculture system which people misunderstood that is destroy the forest. But we've been practicing this more than hundreds of years. So rotational farming is where we find our food. Our sort of food is not just only for the human, but also for the animal, insect, and ecosystem. No? We have conducted the research on the rotational farming that the emission from the burning around 476 tons, but our soil forest can keep the carbon stock more than 700,000. No? And Indigenous women have a very crucial role because 70% of the farming work in the rotational farming is done by the women. So we are holding the knowledge, what seed to plant, what land that suits to which plant. No? This is what is really leading by the women. And this kind of system, we do not use chemical. We use the whole system of natural system to manage. We don't plant only food, but we plant flower as well, which will help us to chase away or lure the insect and other animals not come to our main crop. So we're not just going to plant everywhere, but the way we are doing is rotating. So the best cycle, it will be at least more than 8 years. So the fertilizer and the land will be regenerate the nutrient and good for the next cropping. So this is just show you the variety of the seed that we can get from rotational farming. At least minimum there will be more than 40 variety of seed that we can get from our rotational farming. And each plant, they will grow different time or period. So the whole year we will get different food and different crop. And it's not just only food, no? Our clothes, our ritual, our beliefs is happening there as well. Our language also happening there. So this is part of the relationship of the society, no? But because of the climate change, some of our seed has been disappeared because the increase of the weather and also the drought. However, we still have the native seed that's still resilient to the change of the climate. And this one just showing you even though we just a farmer or indigenous people, but our ancestors do have the knowledge of the soil. They have the category of soil, that different type of soil that is good for cultivation or not, and what kind of plant that is suitable for which different kind of the soil. So these are the name in a current Hokobler. So that some I could not find the English name, it's quite difficult for me, but these are the category of soil that we really using, and women are the one who know the soil density and the surface. They are the one who selecting the soil to plant this. Apart from the soil, we also have knowledge of the forest. So if you related to the scientists, these are our forest type, no? That we also having the knowledge. That's why it's come out from our own language, calling Gobeko, no, pay cost, which is the different kind of forest where we also manage differently. We won't touch the area where is there density of the forest and it's a watershed area. We consider as a sacred area and we won't touch it. We won't pollute it. And people are not allowed to do hunting or any cultivation in those kind of forests. And we also have the forest area where we conduct the ritual, no, to get the blessing or protection from the spirit and God. And you may see the bamboo with the tree, tied with the tree. Some people may know the story where we put the baby umbilical cord into the bamboo and tie with the healthy tree. So you're not allowed to cut that tree because the soul and the spirit of the baby is with that tree. So if you cut down that tree, that means you are killing that person. Yeah, so that is the knowledge where we protect our forest, no, related with the human being, with the nature that you cannot detach from each other. And apart from climate change, I just want to highlight like there are a lot of chemicals that people are using these days, and that is some of the policy that promote the monocrop that linking us many people, including indigenous people and local community, to like have to flow into that system for the monocropping. And you can see this is the data that we get the most of the pesticides from China, and ASEAN is the main market for the China. And you can see Thailand, Vietnam are really the most one who imported pesticide. And we are having the people who are get the sickness from pesticide every year, around 4,000 every year from the using the chemical. So the chemical is not only affect our the land, but it's also affect the life of the people. So, but for us, we not using the chemical, no. These are just some of the photo that we are training our young people how to use the forest sustainably and also know where to find the herbal medicine, find the food, find the sources for the household. No? So because if we're not transferring this knowledge, then this knowledge will be gone. So the women are playing the crucial role in transferring this knowledge as well. Just relating to the land, our presenter already mentioned to recognize the customary land tenure. So because indigenous people, we are only 5% of the population in the world, but we are taking care of the 80% biodiversity of this world. And the land surface, 50% is under our territorial. But we have the challenge because those systems were not recognized, and that is making us, even in the crisis of to combat with the climate change in adaptation and mitigation. This one just show you the number, like 50% of our land is owned by the state. And that means it's a protected national park, conservation park road thing, no? And the one that have the land title is owned by 90%. The 90% of the land owned by only 10% of the people in the country. So where do we live? These are the brown color is where our indigenous people live. And that is the land where the forest still higher number. The 5 ranking number, the number 1 is in Mae Hong Son province, more than 86%. That is 70% is the indigenous people who live in that area. So just to link to see that the one who protecting and also to maintain the ecosystem and the healthy forest and the healthy land is still indigenous people. So that's why we need the recognition of our customary practices. And these are the actions that happening in the ground, how to protect our land, no? So these are the women who are in the action, who are doing GPS mapping to zoning the forest, no? Where is the herbal medicine area, where is the wood area, where is the sacred area of the forest. So we are working together with men because only men cannot do. You need the knowledge from women as well. And the below one is the women who are explaining about their community forest use, no? This is the community map where the women are doing. And women also protecting the forest because these are the photo of we are making the fire break in the community. Every year we have to do that to protect the forest from the fire. And it's a lot of work to do. So the whole community doing, whether you get the budget from the government or not, but it's the collective work of the community people to protect the forest because forest is not only for source of food, but our identity and everything is related to land. So just to finalize, like, of course, we holding different knowledge, so we have to work together, and I think recognize our indigenous people role and our rights to land and territory is very important, not to combat climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for making visible the last words of Minal on the importance of empowering women and the importance of the right to land, which are elements linked to sustainable land management. So I hope the next presentation is ready. Thank you for your patience. And so the last presentation will be given by Balgis Osman El Asha, and it will be a focus on the African context related to the IPCC land report. So the floor is finally yours.
Okay, thank you. Morning again. Thank you. Okay. So as I mentioned, I am going to take land degradation and desertification in the context of Africa. And, okay. So it's working now. Yeah, as I mentioned, climate and land have a very close relationship. And that is why each can impact the other. So a change in climate change can have a large impact on land and land ecosystems, land-based ecosystems in terms of distribution of the vegetation cover, in terms of biodiversity, the species composition, the productivity and nutrients of soils. And for Africa, this is very important because of the close relationship between Africa and the land and their natural resources. In return, land condition can also impact the climate through the different land uses. And we know, for example, in Africa, the emissions from greenhouse gases, the bulk of emissions doesn't come from the energy. It comes from land use change and forestry. So the influence is large of land on climate. Of course, there are different regional differences, and based on that, there are also differences in terms of impacts and in terms of vulnerabilities. And in this context, if we speak about Africa, we find that Africa is already dry, already vulnerable, because more than 40% of Africa is desert. And Africa, there are a large portion of the dry land that was mentioned by Ayman is in Africa. The land in Africa is susceptible to various degrees of risk to climate change, from moderate to high to very high. Only 18% is at low risk. And this will bring about a lot of impacts, of course. Already we witness issues related to food security, famine, and malnutrition. The share of Africa is always the largest. Sorry. I have to do it like that. Okay. Yeah. As I mentioned, there is also a substantial parts of Africa already affected by desertification. Out of the 56 African countries, 46 are already facing desertification, various degrees of desertification. These are some of the indicators which show that the degree to which Africa is vulnerable to issues related to land degradation and desertification. And actually, it has always been the number one problem in Africa. Usually in Africa, climate change like the second to the desertification and land degradation, and that is why this report was of special interest and special importance for Africans. The largest water basins, which have global as well as regional importance, are susceptible to different degrees of degradation, ranging between 26% to 67%. And this, of course, has implications on different livelihoods and economics activities. The Horn of Africa is getting drier, and this is the region where all the time there are famine and conflicts and hunger. Of course, it has economic implications. And for example, the cost of soil degradation were estimated at about 1% of the GDP in middle-income countries like Algeria and Egypt, and about 0.5% in Morocco and Tunisia. So it's a huge loss, actually. Yeah, as I mentioned, the climate risk will increase with the minimum increase in global average global warming. The increase in the vulnerability and impacts on land will be profound, and this the risk include a wide range of risk to vegetation, wildfire, land degradation, food production, and then social costs. And social cost is of special importance to Africa because it breaks this social fabric, which used to be one of the safety net for Africans. Due to famine, the movement, displacement, migration, conflicts, and the loss of this social fabric. Also, of course, the freshwater supplies in many countries, they already at the threshold, and any further reduction will take them to the level of scarcity. The impacts on stable food, and this is also very important because many countries are facing frequent famines, and the three main stable foods like the wheat, rice, and maize are going to decrease by large 60% by with the 1 degree centigrade average global warming for wheat, 7.4 in maize, percent in maize. So the risk of having famine and food insecurity is increasing. This is the figure which has already been explained by Ayman, so I don't need to go over it. Dry land are getting to become more vulnerable, and as I said, most of Africa is located in a dry land area, and so within this dry land zone, there are many millions of people with different livelihoods, nomadic livestock, agriculture, fishing, and their lives will be at risk, especially if we know that, as Ayman has mentioned, desertification will limit their options for adaptation. So these people are in much need for adaptation, and now their options are limited by desertification. So what options will be left for them? It's either migration or we cannot think about what they can do in the near future if the situation continues to be like that. Of course, these are part of the impacts resulting from the desertification aggravated by the impacts of climate change, the ecosystem health, the loss of biodiversity, the impact of food security, and the loss of livelihoods, and of course human well-being. And these things are not like we are waiting to see, they are already happening and they are observed. There are many indicators that many countries are facing similar conditions, water scarcity or loss of infrastructure and life frequently and more frequently. Yeah, and the same thing, the impacts on the crops and livestock and the resulting impacts in terms of poverty and famine. So the risk, is, as I mentioned, is going to be aggravated by the types of the human practices, the consumption, production pattern, the advancement in the technological development. We know that the use of mechanized farming in many parts of Africa, instead of being like a source for food security resulted in the huge areas turning into deserts and negatively impact the food security and the livelihood of the people. So sometimes the situation is only aggravated by climate change. It's already the land uses and practices renders the country very vulnerable, very exposed to impacts by climate change. So, yes, I think, yeah. So whatever the measures for reclamation or restoration, it should take into consideration climate change, of course, and we have to act immediately. So immediate actions to address issues related to land degradation can have a positive impact on the people's livelihood in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of food security, and we can capitalize on these co-benefits because while we are also addressing issues related to climate change mitigation and adaptation, we are addressing issues of poverty and livelihoods. One important element, especially in Africa, is the empowerment of women because we know that more than 70% of the workforce in Africa in the agriculture are women. We need to do more for them in order to enhance their participation. And of course, the whole community already we have the examples, we have experience with the community-based adaptation, community-based natural resource management. So we have to capitalize on this. And of course, not to forget the indigenous knowledge, as my colleague just mentioned, because there is this knowledge either in terms of institutional knowledge or in terms of practices. We need to build on it because this is adaptive and it can provide like fast solutions we cannot ignore. So the challenge is that some of these proposed measures for mitigation, like expansion in biomass for energy, could have a negative impact in food security. So we always need to try to balance between the mitigation aspect and the other important issues related to livelihood, food security, and biodiversity. And of course, we have to work to part of the empowering the women to secure their rights and to provide like equal chances, to provide them with credits so that access to credit so they can play an active role in the climate change process, adaptation and mitigation. And lastly, as they said in the report, land cannot do it all. Yeah, and Ayman mentioned many reasons why we cannot depend on land. Other sectors, reduction in other sectors are vital to relieve the pressure on land. And of course, this is a big issue now. People, they don't like to see their forests like kept aside as a sink for carbon dioxide while their livelihood depend on it. They have this special relations as my colleague just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to invite all the speakers to join me here. Just come back. So just join me here, and let's now open the question session. So who would you like to start? Any questions for the speakers, physically present or remotely present, please?
Thank you very much. I have a question to the lady from Thailand. You mentioned indigenous women play a crucial role for farming and basic health care. So my question is, what man is doing?
Would you like to provide a precise answer about the role of men? Please.
Of course, I'm highlighting the role of women more as is mostly is visible because women are very invisible. That's why I try to highlight the role of women, but doesn't mean like men doesn't do anything. In the farm, we are doing together, but like as I say, they are holding different knowledge, no? That I say. So that's why the farming, women are the one who are master of the rotational farming. It's just other farming like paddy field also men also doing. So when we are do cultivation, men will, how to say, plant the soil, and then the women are following, especially for the young women and men. That is where they met and they fall in love, no? Because they are doing work together, and the men are also taking the role of like hunting. So they are more going to a different sort of area of forest. That is what they are doing. And also in the indigenous system, men are still taking the role of making decisions as the most. So outside the household, mostly is still men. And inside the household is still women. But this is why we are doing to promote women, empower women more to be in a decision making and to be more visible. Yes.
Thank you. Any other questions? So on the first row and then the second row.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question for...
Can you put the microphone closer?
Yes. I have a question for our colleague from Africa. Desertification made a nice presentation, but do you have any idea of the impact of population growth on future and on past degradation and future degradation? Because that's one aspect which is very important too. And I have also a question for our colleague from indigenous people in Asia. What is the population density today, and how is it evolving? That's another question. And in addition to that, you mentioned that you are importing pesticides from China. And I don't think that they are used in forests, but do you have any idea of the toxicity of these different products that you import? Thank you.
Okay, so the first question about demography.
Yeah, actually the issue of population in Africa is not an issue of number. It is an issue of distribution. Because in terms of number, Africa is the least actually populated continent compared to the area. But the distribution, of course, can have an impact, and I know there are a number of studies about the impact of the urbanization, issues like urbanization, which has to do with population accumulated in around cities, and their impact on land degradation. Of course, this is an issue all over Africa, in many countries in Africa. Also, some of the areas where population are like refugee camps, there is large deterioration and land degradation around these areas. But I cannot speak about population increase as like it is like a serious threat for Africa at this stage. Maybe in the future, because the projection is that the population will increase by far in the future. Yeah. So if there is anything, we have to start now for that. Explosion, the coming one. Yeah.
Thank you. And what is your perspective on the two questions? I think they were related to population density as well as toxicity of pesticides.
The first question, thank you very much that you're asking about the indigenous population. Actually, roughly there is say like 2/3 of indigenous population is living in Asia. But sadly, we not really have the accurate data because that kind of information is more than 10 years, like decades. And another challenge is because most of our government in Asia, they not recognize indigenous peoples. That's why we still struggling with our rights, indigenous people rights. This is why we are come together and raise the issue of indigenous people together, recognize. Because once it's recognized that it is help in injustice. So even though we try to campaign with the government to collect the data on indigenous people as well, so to see how many of us, but in Thailand we are only 1 or 2%. And different countries like Nepal, they also have almost 50% they are indigenous people. So different countries, we have different number of population, but still we are struggling the same struggle, like to be recognized, as indigenous people, and our right is not really come into implementation. That's why we are still struggling until here. That's why we have to come up here to raise our issue. And another one about the import of the pesticide. This one just the information that China is the number one, not that we imported like in ASEAN. But then we also have another country that is our sort of the pesticides, like China number one, second one is India, third one is Switzerland, fourth one is Japan, the fifth one Indonesia, and the sixth is Germany. These are the chemical that our ASEAN country imported. This one just based on Thailand report, and within 10 years, the number is always has increased. It never reduced. And the paraquat is the one is really killing the people. This is one of the, our government try to ban it. Many countries try to ban it, but still the private sector, they still fight for that because, we still driven by the profit. We still driven by the mass production, and we are still running in the same direction that destroying our future, no? So, yeah, I hope like we really can make any change here, like our government will change the way they are seeing the world right now. We should not base only GDP. We have to think more in the future, how can we live, because if we still continue like this, we don't have the same world like we live as we see today. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think Minal would also like to provide her perspective on that question. Minal, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Valerie. I'm responding to the first question on future population, and I apologize if I'm repeating something Palkis said because the voice wasn't very clear. But I think what I wanted to mention was that the report assesses these future pathways, which is the shared socio-economic pathways that Eamon showed in the figure. And it's not just the population, which is compared across the different shared socio-economic pathways, but it is also the income levels and how future societies will develop. And some of these risks can change depending on the socio-economic scenario. So for example, you could have a more sustainable scenario with lower population growth, high incomes, and more sustainable consumption. So it's not just the numbers, but also how future societies will develop and grow that will change how the risks will happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Minal. Could you please pass the microphone to the person just behind you? Thank you. Please.
Hello, do you hear me? So my question is aimed towards the last and maybe first presenter. So it's about mitigation measures. And my questions relate to the Sahel region. I read about some kind of plan to build a big tree wall in the Sahel region in order to stop desertification of the Sahara Desert. Do you think that's a good plan? What are your general thoughts on that? Would it curb this desertification in the area?
So the question is about green belts.
Yeah. Yes.
Yemen, would you like to start?
Sure. So that's actually featured in, I think, Chapter 3 as a case study as well. So there's more detail in Chapter 3 on the Great Green Wall Initiative. I think it's important to put this in the context of one of the findings from these chapters was that solutions need to be situation-specific and location-specific. And there's really a risk of maladaptation, where we might use species, for example, that would be non-native species or species that wouldn't be adapted to the climate in specific regions. So I think in general, there's great potential for initiatives like that. I think they're really potentially very, very useful, and especially as they involve, collaboration across different countries and regions. But there's also a need to be careful to ensure that the species used and the methods used to drive those initiatives are specifically suitable to those regions.
So native species, or they could be not native but have to be suitable?
They'd have to be suitable, yeah. So not necessarily always native, but where they're non-native especially, I think you'd have to be careful that you don't end up in a situation where they can cause issues in the future. Yeah.
Would you like to add something?
I just agree with you that it is like situation specific, and green not necessarily mean that it is a stand of trees. In case of the green wall in Africa, it is like all green practices. So whatever suit specific country, specific climatic or circumstances, they can practice it. So energy conservation can be part of this green wall. Sustainable rangeland can be part of it. So all types of activities that contribute to restoration and rehabilitation or conservation of the environment can be part of this green wall. So it is not like a stand of trees, like shelter belt for wind. It is a wall again. It's desert encroachment, but it is a wall that is a livelihood based. Yeah.
So there are a number of case studies based on the available literature that are reported in the desertification chapter of the full report. There's limited information in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and there's a need for more actually to report on lessons learned on these multiple dimensions. Any other question? Please? I also invite the female participants in the audience to express questions if they wish.
Hi, I'm Joan. I'm from Spain, and I had a question regarding pesticides. I'm not like an expert regarding it, but since the topic was raised, I just wanted to ask. And there are some pros and cons regarding pesticides, right? For example, with pesticides, and there has been and there will be an annual crop growth, right? And it can help us to grow the growing population, to feed the growing population. Also, it can like control diseases, but it has some cons, especially in low and middle income countries, especially with these toxic pesticides. So from my standpoint of view, from what I've read and listened to, my answer would be not to ban them, but to control them and have a strong regulation. So, but I'm not an expert, so that's why I'm asking you. What's your standpoint of it? Thank you.
Any expert of pesticides?
Sorry. I don't know, because for me, seeing the people in the local community dying and get cancer from that, even though you have many good law, European, Asian, Africa, I don't know, but the life of people is losing every day. I don't know what protection, because when it comes to implementation, it never work out. There are a lot of promises here as well. It never be implemented. So I'm not sure like how many we are waiting for the good law and recognition on that. So I think we really have to change this one. No? I don't know only protection on that one will be work or not, because from the ground level, it's not. And the more you feeding the greed, it's not like you feeding for the need. You feed for the greed. That's why it's happened this way. There's still potential that our land and water and natural resource still can feed the people in the world. But the way we live, we go beyond that. We over expand and using everything over based on our need. We just go for money. So I think no matter what, good war, green war, whatever regulation, I don't believe in it. Unless we change the way we seeing the world and the way we live right now, so we can save other people's life as well, not just only thinking our well-being, our AC heater in the room. Yeah.
Would you like to complement this perspective?
Yeah, so I think one of the findings in this report is that we do need to produce more food on a smaller area of land, because we need to free up land for other uses like afforestation and bioenergy. So that's a massive challenge, obviously, with growing populations globally. So at the same time, we can make some of those gains through intensification, but what this report found was that if we don't intensify in a sustainable way, be it with agrochemicals or with livestock rates on land, stocking rates, for example, if we don't do that sustainably, there's going to be negative consequences on the environment, and that could lead to land degradation or desertification. And if it does, then that's really an own goal in some ways, because degraded land or desertified land is actually going to be a source of carbon dioxide emissions, for example, as opposed to a sink. So we have to be really careful, and I think that applies to pesticides and fertilizers in general, that where they're used, that they're used in a sustainable way. And obviously there's issues around regulation, and that's different in different parts of the world as well. But yeah, I think it would be very difficult to ban them if we want to achieve our goals for more food from a smaller area of land.
Actually, this report has not done an in-depth assessment of this aspect because it requires to look at more perspectives, including the quality of water, soils, biodiversity from insects to birds and other dimensions. And so there are other elements in the biodiversity IP-based assessment report as well, bringing in these other perspectives. And this report has a limited component related to a scientific assessment, in fact. Any other question, please? The gentleman in the back.
Good morning to you all. I'm from the Gambia. My name is Sekou. Actually, I was here for the first presentation, which I missed. But the presentation by Minal has addressed some of my concerns. I would like to ask the last and the second to last presenter on two questions. For the second to last presenter, I would want to know, you've mentioned the issue of Thailand being owned by 10% of the 10% of the land owned by 97% of the land owned by 10% of the population, and 57% of Thailand is state land. I wonder how much of Thailand now that is owned by those 10% of the individuals, because the presentation didn't show that. Then to the last presenter, I am a little bit scared. The map that is showing desertification showed the Gambia as an island within a desert kind of situation. So if that map is played, in the southern part of the Gambia, I think it is still green, not desert. So, but I'm scared because I'm from Gambia. So that's why I'm asking for clarification on that. Thank you very much for the brilliant presentations.
So the first question was about the ownership of land in Thailand.
The one I show, 50% of the land in Thailand, 57% is owned by the state. So that means the ownership, the one managing and control is the state. And the 43%, that is public land, I mean private land, like everyone can own. 90% is owned by the 10% of the people. So you may not thinking about indigenous people and local community who are owning those kind of land, that big amount of land. That's why I just highlight, like, to recognize the customary land tenure is very important, because that will help the people to be able to capacity not to be able to adapt and also mitigate to the climate change. And not only that percent, we not even know yet how many percent is owned by the women. So we are in the crisis situation where you really don't have ability to access to that, to the food, to other sources of your livelihood, no? And also that is cost to you will lose your identity as indigenous people. That is just the example from Thailand, but it doesn't limit to Thailand. This is the scenario that is happening in the globe, yeah.
Thank you. And the question for you was about Gambia and the specificities of trends.
Yeah, actually, this shows areas which at the risk of desertification. Of course, it is not like it doesn't go down to these details of each country, but generally these are areas which with high risk if conditions continue as business as usual because of socioeconomic factors in addition to increase in temperature, global temperature due to climate change.
Okay, we have time for a final question, if there's any. Okay. The last one.
It's not really, excuse me, it's not really a question, it's a comment about what you have shown about the decrease of maize production in Africa due to climate change. I think it's very important, and it's not sufficiently underlined in the IPCC report, you have to distinguish what is the impact when you have business as usual practices. And in that case, of course, because when you don't increase the inputs in Africa, you will stay and even have a decrease in production. But you have, when you have a look at the IFPRI studies for all these African countries, and most of them, you can see that you can maintain the production in spite of the climate change. And that's very important. And if you look at other low latitude countries, like India, like East Africa, Brazil, you see that they have increased the production. And in comparison to Africa, where the level of production, in particular for cereals, which is well documented, it has been remained very low, about 1 ton per hectare, around 1 ton per hectare, compared to what they have in, for instance, India, 3 to 4 tons, and even in Brazil. So but you have to distinguish the two. And the lesson here would be, if you put more input, and we had a discussion the other day here in the Coronivia session, you could increase the production and decrease the land use change. That's very important. So I think this is an aspect which is missing to some extent.
Thank you for the comment. It's actually quite covered in the chapter 5 on food security and solutions within food production. I think there are other side events that will dive deeper into this component of the report. This one was focused on degradation and desertification. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with him that the vulnerability and the impact is not just a function of the climate change impact. It's many socio-economic factors and which can have impact. Of course, climate change will aggravate the situation. And these cases, I think they can be like good practices and maybe can be upscaled, documented and upscaled, because we want to see these cases where, in spite of climate change, the system is working, functioning. So that means it has good adaptation. And this is what we actually we would like to see. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So with that, I would like to thank all the speakers, Minal for attending remotely, and the 3 speakers present today, and the audience for the interactive question session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, everyone.